transitioning, and the way I think about it is sort of some of the philosophies and principles when you're applying it to governance that is sort of shaping your view. And one of the things that you've talked a good amount, as I understand it, around sort of the AUMF is repealing it. I was wanting to sort of just let you speak for a minute about what you envision replacing it. What does that sort of cover? Are there any sort of elements like special forces that would not have to apply to the same sort of rules as the rest of the conventional forces? And just let you have a sort of a minute to sort of describe your vision of what should happen with the existing AUMFs from the War on Terror and what sort of governance structures Congress should put in place going forward.
I appreciate that. And this is an issue near and dear to my heart. There needs to be both retrospective and prospective actions taken on the AUMF. So first is a repeal of the authorization for the use of military force. And then there needs to be a backwards look, going back the last 2 decades, to understand what rationales were put in place to allow for our use of force overseas within the confines of the AUMF, because we're operating in scores of countries overseas right
Something
now.
like 80, I believe. Yeah.
Depends on which DOD.
Which numbers you're looking at. Maybe you have better numbers than I do.
But a lot. And we want to understand, turn over every stone, look at every single legal document and say, what has been the legal structure, both the foundation and the superstructure that has been built over the last 2 decades for the AUMF. So we know what we're dealing with. And then repeal and replace the AUMF. And then prospectively, it's got to be big picture, a much more muscular assertion over Congress's role in making war. And part of the challenge that we have is that when the Constitution was drafted, making war was a lot more clear cut about what we were talking about than it is now. There's always been gray areas in human conflict, but it was pretty clear when you had redcoats hitting the shore and when you didn't, and when you were conscripting people and when you weren't. Nowadays, a lot of this happens outside of the viewpoint outside of the viewfinder of the American voter. It's happening in countries a lot of voters haven't heard about. It's happening with special operations. It's happening at the intersection of the CIA and the DoD. It's happening in cybersecurity. It's happening with drones. And so it's getting much more complicated. It's getting much more, the gray area has expanded, and it's becoming much easier for the president to do surgical strikes. So we need to go back and say, the war powers resolution, this idea that the president basically gets a 90 days of freebie to do whatever he wants, no longer makes sense. 90 days is an eternity in modern special operations and intelligence. It needs to be like in the span of hours that you give the president a free hand based on self-defense of the nation. And otherwise, he needs to be consulting with Congress and getting congressional approval. And it needs to be on a country-by-country basis as well. If there's legitimate rationale that we are neutralizing imminent threats to the United States, then come to Congress with that, explain the rationale, and we'll give you approval for it.
Mm-hmm. And how do you sort of envision that going forward as far as drafting the policy and getting the rest of Congress on board to sort of reclaim some of these constitutional war powers that we're talking about?
Forget about the rest of Congress, try the rest of the Democratic Party. What I am describing right now, unfortunately, is not even a majority position within the Democratic Party, I wouldn't say right now. So we've got serious work to do. I think there is a general atrophy of congressional power since the Vietnam era, especially in foreign policy, but also in domestic policy making as well, where Congress has become sclerotic. It has ceded too much power to the executive on a number of fronts. And we need a modernization of Congress that allows us to be the Article 1, the primary branch of government, as the one closest to the people.
On the, continuing with the topic of the AUMF, how do you feel about, basically a sunset clause or something to that nature where Congress would have to reaffirm the decision to be at war? Take the War on Terror, for example, whether that would exist in the form of every year Congress has to re-vote and reapprove an existing conflict and the deployment of troops to sort of provide a direct feedback loop to the American voter if Congress is voting the wrong way. Would you envision that once Congress sort of is able to, well, hopefully, basically reclaim their constitutional duty and fulfill their constitutional duty, that something like that could come into play down the road.
I'm actually a big fan of sunset clauses across a lot of policy domains. They're a very healthy way to force government to maintain, to update its Bayesian priors, to use decision-making language.